Good afternoon. My name is Charlie Whelan. I'm a Dartmouth 88 and a visiting senior lecturer at the Rockefeller Center. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the launch of the 2011 Dartmouth Lecture Series, Leading Issues in Politics and Policy. I am the lead instructor in a parallel course that we're offering called Contemporary Issues in American Policy and Politics. The speakers who are giving their public talks in this venue are also sharing their time with students in a class, and the students will drill down more deeply on some of the issues that will come up in these lectures. The goal of both the lecture series and the course is threefold. The first is to bring these policymakers to campus and help us engage in the world by sharing their experiences and their complexities. The second is to offer an intense intellectual experience to our sophomores that will characterize part of their academic experience during this unique time that they share on campus with just their class. And then last, this year in particular, is to leverage our role here in New Hampshire as the first presidential primary state, and at a time when we have lots of candidates and other interested folks coming through the state, to reach out as an educational institution and make use of that unique timing. So before we get on with the event, I want to thank a lot of the people who've helped to make this possible. So starting with the team of professors, our course and these lecture series are intermediated by a team of academics. So I am one of them. Andrew Samwick is here today, Bruce Sacerdote. Bruce is in the economics department. Andrew is head of the Rockefeller Center. We also have Deborah Brooks, who will be coming out later, and Dean Lacey, both of whom are in the government department. So it is truly an interdisciplinary and multi-person affair. I also would really like to thank President Kim and his team for putting resources and logistics behind this. It's not an accident that we have the people of this caliber coming to campus. This was a real concerted effort on behalf of the president to make this an important part of the summer experience. And last, I'd like to thank Jen Murray, who is our senior person in terms of making the trains run on time. I think without her, we would have a speaker, but probably not a venue, maybe a venue without a speaker. She's the person who kind of brought it all together. So I will soon turn the rostrum over to Deborah Brooks, who's going to introduce our speaker and moderate the subsequent discussion. Before I do that, I want to forward promote some of the events that we have coming up this summer. First, and most immediately, tomorrow at 4 o'clock in Spalding, we have Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner. So tomorrow, 4 o'clock in Spalding. On the 14th of July, we have President Jim Kim speaking about healthcare challenges in the United States. On July 25th, we have John Huntsman, now declared presidential candidate and former ambassador to China and governor of Utah. On the 28th of July, we have Joel Klein, former chancellor of the New York City Public Schools. On August 4th, we have Robert Reich, class of '68, former Secretary of Labor. And then on August 11th, we have his classmate, Henry Paulson, '68, obviously former Secretary of the Treasury. On August 18th, we have Jeff Immelt, '78, CEO and member of the Board of CEO of GE and member of the Dartmouth Board of Trustees. And then we will conclude on August 23rd with Frank Newport, who is editor-in-chief of the Gallup organization. So we will hear from a number of people talking about important policy issues, and we will finish with Gallup telling us what the public thinks about a lot of this stuff, most likely that they don't like most of the things that we need to do. So let's get on with it. Let me introduce our moderator for today's talk, my colleague in Teaching Public Policy 20, Deborah Brooks. She has just been promoted to associate professor in the government department. Prior to coming to Dartmouth, she worked at the Gallup organization, where she designed and analyzed polling data. Her research here at Dartmouth revolves around elections, including issues such as the influence of negative advertising and whether gender stereotypes cause voters to hold female candidates to different standards on the campaign trail. In fact, she's the author of a book that will soon be coming out called He Runs, She Runs, Gender Stereotypes, Double Standards, and Political Campaigns. So please welcome Deb Brooks, who will introduce our speaker, and she will also moderate the discussion once we do Q&A after Senator Gregg has given his remarks. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you all for coming today. We are very fortunate today to have with us Senator Judd Gregg to launch this truly exciting speaker series. For those of us at Dartmouth and in the wider community who are fascinated by politics and policy, and for people who are just interested in learning more about the issues at hand of the day, It is very clear that this is going to be an incredible summer. Senator Judd Gregg was practically born into New Hampshire politics. At the age of 5, his father, Hugh Gregg, was elected to be the governor of New Hampshire. Years later, law degree in hand, he ran for Congress, and he was a U.S. congressman for his district in New Hampshire for 4 terms. He then served 2 terms as governor of New Hampshire before running for the U.S. Senate, where he served 3 terms before deciding that he wasn't going to run for his Senate seat again. In 3 decades of electoral politics, he's never lost an election. That's really an amazing feat. And that's especially amazing in a state like ours that, especially in recent election cycles, has gone back and forth between red and blue. It's also amazing given that at lunch he mentioned that he's never run a campaign poll while he was running for office. It's really a remarkable feat to have that many wins under his belt. Among his many other accomplishments, Senator Gregg is a leading national expert on fiscal policy and the budget, and he was one of the chief negotiators of the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008. In an era where most politicians today are all too easy to categorize, Senator Gregg is a political leader who defies easy categorization. On some issues, he's been a leader on pushing a straight Republican partisan line. On other issues, he's been at the forefront of pushing for bipartisanship and compromise, and is often lauded for his tendencies in those areas. As a testament to that, President Obama moved to nominate him to the position of Secretary of Commerce in his administration. He ultimately declined that position, but President Obama's interest in having him in that role says a great deal about Senator Gregg's ability to reach across the aisle to pass policy. In short, I'm very pleased to welcome Senator Judd Gregg here to speak with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Brooks, and it's great to be here today, and President Kim, and Professor Whelan, and members of the community, the Dartmouth community. I didn't go to Dartmouth, but Kathy and I, my wife, sent all our money here because we had 3 children go here. So it's been very much a part of our lifestyle as a family, and all 3 of our children, ironically, had their reunion this last weekend, I think, or the weekend before, and so they were wandering around the campus again and remembering wonderful times here. All of them truly enjoyed their experience at Dartmouth. I wanted to talk a little bit tonight and then take questions about whatever's on your mind, but I want to talk about our fiscal situation as a nation because it is rather dire. I didn't want to depress you or ruin your day, but as a very practical matter, if we're not honest in discussing this issue, we're not going to be able to solve the issue. And unfortunately, the issue is acute for us as a nation. I put up this quote because I'm a huge fan of Adam Smith, but he said many things over 200 years ago that made sense. He obviously defined the concept of market economy and comparative advantage, but he made this comment about countries and nations. He said nations weren't impoverished by their people, they're impoverished by their governments, specifically governments that don't act well or don't do the job they're supposed to do. He used the word prodigality. I assume there's some person in this audience who knows what that means. I had to look it up. It's an old Scottish term for mismanagement, waste, ineffectiveness as a governance. And why do I put that up? Well, because we are unfortunately on the verge of being poorly governed as a nation if we don't get our house in order. There's clearly a very serious issue of debt for this nation. There's some standards that I want to refer to. The European Union set out when it formed a set of standards for admission of clients of states into the European Union, into the Eurozone. Now, we don't want to get into the European Union, but it was a group of industrialized states which had made a decision on what made sense for a well-run country. And what they concluded was that a debt-to-GDP ratio, public debt, to GDP ratio shouldn't exceed 60%. In other words, your public debt shouldn't exceed 60% of your gross national product. Secondly, they concluded that your deficits to GDP ratio shouldn't exceed 3.3% of gross national product. So if you had a debt to GDP ratio that exceeds 60% of your gross national product, where your deficits was exceeding 3%, you weren't allowed in the European Union. The problem we have today is that we could not get into the European Union. Not that we want to be there, but that standard, which is an standard for industrialized nations, we have crossed that Rubicon. We have a debt to GDP ratio this year, which is 64%. And I want to talk in specifics about how we got there and what we need to do to address it. This chart, and there's some students here who I had the good fortune to participate in their class earlier who've seen this before. I'm going to have to put up with this again. But if I say it twice, I don't know what effect that'll have. Probably none. But in any event, this chart shows industrialized nations' debts to GDP ratio. And you'll see that the first nation, Japan, has a very serious problem. They have a 250+% debt to GDP ratio, but they have a unique advantage. They save so much, the Japanese people save so much that they can finance that from within. They don't have to go to China to borrow the money. They don't have to go to Russia or to the oil states to borrow their money in order to finance their debt. Every dollar that we borrow as a country, the United States I'm talking about, 45 cents of it now is borrowed from overseas, most of it coming from China and the oil states. The second country that has a very serious problem is Iceland. Iceland has already gone bankrupt. They went bankrupt. Greece is the third. Greece is on the verge of bankruptcy. Who knows how it's going to be handled, but clearly it is insolvent as a nation. Italy is the fourth. Nobody knows what's happening in Italy because they keep all these different books and nobody can figure it out. But as a very practical matter, we know they got problems. The fifth is Ireland. Ireland, again, is bankrupt. It is basically essentially declared bankruptcy for all intents and purposes. It hasn't had an insolvency event, but that's simply because the European Union stepped in. Belgium's a small nation, probably not a good example in here. What's the seventh country to have the largest debt to GDP ratio and therefore a very significant problem? It's regrettably ourselves, the United States. This chart shows what it costs a country to roll over that debt. In other words, we lend money to countries and to our people to finance our debt, and then at some point that debt obligation ends and it has to be paid again or borrowed again. Borrowed again. You can see from this chart that in the maturing debt area, the United States has the second biggest problem. Why is that an issue? Well, it's an issue because as the United States has to go into the market to borrow money to replace bonds which are coming due, it takes money out of the market, which might be used somewhere else, presumably in the private sector for more productive activity. So the rolling over issue is a very serious issue for an economy of our scale. Unfortunately, the debt to GDP ratio is not something that's self-correcting. In fact, it's going in just the wrong direction. As you can see from this chart, it's going directly up. And as I mentioned, 60% is considered to be a line that shouldn't be crossed. When you get to 80%, you're basically in a spiral which can't be corrected. At least that's what most economists think. And you can't catch your tail, so to say. In other words, you can't finance your way out of the debt because your interest rates are rising faster than your capacity to maintain debt, unless you had a massive growth in the size of the government. So you can see in the size of the economy. So you can see here that, unfortunately, our debt projections are going straight up. And we will pass the 90% level debt to GDP ratio before the year 2020, which is an unsustainable and disastrous event. It's driven primarily by the rate of growth of the government. You know, some people say, well, it's lack of tax revenues. I'll get into that. But primarily, this is a spending event. The government is growing much faster than it has historically grown. Historically, the size of the United States government has been about 20% of GDP, 19.8 to be accurate, since the end of World War II. That's the green line running across all the way across. As you can see, we now have a government that's just crossed the 24% line, and it headed down for a little while, and then it's headed back up. We can get into this discussion, but the big spike was caused in large part by the stimulus package. And you would have thought that after the stimulus package was completed, that there would be a retrenchment in the size of the government. I mean, that's historically the way things work. As you try to come out of a recession, the Keynesian philosophy is you spend a lot of money, and then after the recession is over, government comes back to a reasonable size, and you do one-time spending. But that's not the case now. It came down a little bit, but it's headed right back up. There are two factors driving that arrow going up, the spending. One was the president's health care bill, which increased the size of the government by $2.5 trillion over 10 years. The second and much bigger factor is something I'll get into here in a second. Now, we could handle deficits and debt if it was a temporary event. In other words, we're a strong enough economy, so we're resilient. We can deal with a momentary event of 3, 4, 5 years where the deficit spikes, but you can't handle it if it's an extended event. And this chart regrettably shows that we are in an extraordinary situation. We've never had this before as a nation. The largest deficit we've ever had was $450 billion, and that was in 2008. That was the largest. Last year, the year before, and next year, we're heading for deficits which will exceed $1.3 to $1.5 trillion. That's about 9 to 10% of our economy, by the way. That's way over the 3.3% standard that I mentioned. But more importantly, we could handle this if it was just an aberrational event. More importantly, as you can see, the average deficits in this country will be $1 trillion a year for as far as the eye can see. And that is not sustainable. That's what's adding to the deficit. That's what's adding to the debt and causing it to grow to these astronomical proportions in relationship to our economy. To try to put this in other terms, we are doubling the debt in 5 years. We will triple the debt in 10 years under the present scenario of the way the federal government is functioning. To try to put it in personal terms, because we had a bunch of students here, a student today owes about $85,000, would owe about $85,000 to pay off the federal debt. By 2017, that same student is going to owe $196,000 to pay off the federal debt. And by the way, it is their burden. I mean, they're the ones that are going to get stuck with this bill. Now, $196,000 is actually more than the net worth of almost of most Americans. That would be at the high end of the average American's net worth. Put it another way. Every second of the day, we add $56,000 to the national debt. $56,000 every second. The average income of an American family is $56,000. So we're essentially wiping out the average income of a family every second. Interest costs on the debt are staggering. Now, you got to appreciate what interest costs mean. Interest costs is lost money. I mean, when you pay interest costs, you get nothing for it. You don't get a new road, you don't get better education, you don't get better defense, you don't get better environmental protection. You just send money out to somebody to pay interest. And unfortunately, a large percentage of that money is going overseas. It's going to people, or the governments, foreign governments, primarily China, and as I said, the oil-producing nations and Russia. So we're basically putting money out that could have been used to basically make us a stronger and better nation, and instead it's going to something which has absolutely no return. Interest on the federal debt will be the single largest item in the federal budget, and this has never happened. The single largest item in the federal budget within 7 years, and it will exceed, for example, national defense spending. What's the primary sources of this huge swing? It's in deficit and debt. It's primarily spending. Primarily spending, as this chart shows, although some will argue it's tax cuts. It really isn't. Spending is the problem. I'll get into that more specifics. What's driving this? Well, as I mentioned, there are two primary factors. The second primary factor, and by far the largest factor, is a massive demographic shift that's occurring in this country, which demands utilization of our social services called entitlements. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, those three programs alone will absorb 20% of the gross national product, and remember 20% is what we've historically spent as a federal government, by the year 2030. That means that if you pay off those three programs' obligations, you can't spend anything on education, on national defense, on environmental protection, on laying out roads, if you're going to maintain the government at its present size, if you allow those programs to grow at that rate. Try to put this in another context, the Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid cost. It's an $81 trillion, that's trillion with a T, unfunded liability, $81 trillion in those three accounts. Primarily Medicare is the driver of this. I don't know what $1 trillion is, so let me try to put it in context. If you take all the money paid in taxes since the federal government started collecting taxes in 1789, you get $48 trillion. More significantly, if you take the net worth of this nation, all the stocks of Americans, all the bonds of Americans, all the value in our houses, all the value in our cars, all our income, net income, you have $55 trillion. So we actually have an obligation on the books from these three programs, which exceeds our national net worth by 50%. What's that term for that? It's called bankruptcy. What's driving this? It's a massive aging of population. It's not just our country that has this occurring. Western Europe has this occurring. That's why they've got the demographic. That's why they've got their sovereign debt issues. Japan has it occurring. That's why it has its sovereign debt issues. But basically, we have a huge explosion in the number of people who are retiring. We're going from 35 million retired people to 70 million retired people within the next 5 years. Because the baby boom generation, which is the dominant generation, which produced all this energy for our country throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, is moving into retirement. And they're all have access to entitlement programs, primarily Medicare and Social Security. See, these programs were conceived. The reason they worked was because they were conceived by Roosevelt, and was one of the geniuses of Roosevelt, as pyramids. It was always presumed that there'd be many more people paying into these programs than taking out of these programs, and it worked for a long time. Social Security, for example, in 1950, had 16.5 people paying in for every one person taking out. It was a very supportable system, actuarially sound. Today, however, because of this demographic shift, we're looking at 2.2 people paying in for every one person who takes out. We've gone from a pyramid to a rectangle, and clearly it isn't supportable. I put this chart up because I find it entertaining, and it sort of gets to a tangential but fairly significant point. On this axis is the debt to GDP ratio. On that axis is economic and political freedom, as determined by the Heritage Foundation, which is a legitimate think tank in Washington, conservative-based, but very legitimate. You'll notice that the countries with the highest debt to GDP ratio have the highest political and economic freedom. And the countries, many of which are market economies but state-run, who have the lowest political freedom, have the lowest debt to GDP ratio. Well, why is that? The answer is pretty simple. Elections. Elections. Which leads to a basic axiom which we're confronting as a nation, and which Western Europe's confronting, and which Japan has confronted, which is that in a populist government, in other words, a democratically elected government, when a populist government meets a massive demographic shift in an entitlement society, what you get is unsustainable debt. And that's what we're confronting now. Now, Willie Sutton, who was the bank robber, said, I rob banks because that's where the money is. So if you're going to fix this problem, you got to go where the money is. And the money is in Medicare. I put this chart up because I think it's probably the most serious statement of our problem and the most discouraging chart that I have. I have some positive ones coming up, by the way. Believe me, I do. Not many. But if you look at this, you'll see that tax revenues have been approximately 18.2% of GDP for a long time. As I mentioned a couple times, spending has been approximately 19.8% of GDP. The red line, however, is spending as it's projected. The blue line is revenues as it's projected. As you will note, revenues are projected to exceed our historic norm by a considerable amount. I mean, a percent of revenues is a lot of money in our economy. But because the spending is going straight up, this gap here, I'm not sure that this pointer shows it very well, but this gap here is the structural systemic deficit caused by the massive demographic shift and the expansion of government, primarily as a result of health care. And if it continues that way, in other words, if this red line is not brought down to a sustainable level where the blue line can come up and have some sort of reasonable chance of economic closure here, then basically you've got bankruptcy as a nation. I mean, there's no two ways about this. I mean, these are undeniable series of numbers and facts. You cannot sustain this type of debt level for an extended period of time and expect a world economy which you're depending on for lending to support your borrowing. Why? Because someday somebody's going to wake up and say, I wonder if they can pay all that money back. I'm not sure I want to be in a dollar as my currency. And the dollar comes under pressure, and there's a run on the dollar, and the debt becomes very hard to sell, and the debt becomes too expensive, and you hit a situation in a much larger sense, but not unlike what's happening with some of our European neighbors. And so this is an event waiting to happen. And that's why you see so much discussion about this now, because people have finally faced up to the fact that it is waiting to happen, that the people who are driving this event, the baby boom generation, are retiring. And that they are going to double the number of people on the entitlement programs, and that there is no way that we can support that under our present government structure. So what should we do? Well, first off, we should acknowledge the problem, and we should step up and try to solve it. I was talking in this class before, and I said, go to Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill said, America will do the right thing after it's tried all the wrong things. Well, we're right now trying all the wrong things. We got to try the right thing. And we got sort of a simple choice here. The students weren't young and old enough to remember this, but there used to be an oil filter ad. Remember Fram oil filter saying you can pay me now or you can pay me later? It can be a reasonable cost now, or it can be an uncontrollable catastrophic event later, with the cost being much higher. We have to make some tough decisions, and primarily they have to come on the spending side of the ledger. President Obama appointed a commission, the Simpson-Bowles Commission, which I had the good fortune to serve on. There are 18 people. The Simpson-Bowles Commission came back with a proposal to take $4 trillion out of the deficit and debt over a 10-year period. The agreement at the beginning, set out by the terms of Simpson and Bowles, was that the primary source of reduction in deficit and debt would come on the spending side of the ledger, because that's where the primary problem is, as is shown by this chart. But there would also be revenues on the table. Mitch McConnell picked the 3 most fiscally conservative people he could find in the Senate and put them on the commission, because he didn't want anything that was reported by the commission and wasn't voted for by his Republican members on the commission to come back to the conference, because he wouldn't have had their support. So he put myself, he put Tom Coburn, and Mike Crapo from Idaho and from Oklahoma, respectively. And ironically, Harry Reid did the same thing on the other side. He put the most progressive people on the commission, including Dick Durbin from Illinois. So the commission came back with this proposal. Now, it proposed $4 trillion of savings in the debt, or reduction in the debt. 70% of that came out of spending reductions, 30% came from revenues. And it had some really creative ideas in it, like totally rewriting our tax laws, which we need to do to make them more effective for collection of revenues and also from an investment standpoint, so people invest in order to generate revenue and economic activity and thus jobs rather than to avoid taxes. And it reformed Social Security, made it actuarially solvent for 75 years. Unfortunately, the proposals of this commission, which were voted for by the 3 Republican members of the Senate and by Dick Durbin, and 5 of the president's 6 appointees to the commission, were never followed up on and were left on the table, which was a huge mistake. So I've come up with my list. Here's 6 easy things we can do, and they aren't that difficult. All they take is consensus. Now, you can't address the issue of Social Security or Medicare if you do it in a partisan way. You just can't do it. The American people are inherently suspicious of people who try to fix Social Security and Medicare. I mean, you don't get the benefit of the doubt when you step into that water, believe me. The only way they will accept changes in those 2 programs, which affect so many Americans, is if they believe they are fair. And the only way you can have fairness, both in a perception standpoint and probably in a substantive way, in our society, politically, is to have bipartisanship. So you have to have a bipartisan agreement on these core issues of huge public policy, like how you reform Social Security, how you reform Medicare, and how you reform the tax laws, too. So this is my list of what I think we could do. I'd be happy to talk about them in specifics if you want. But right now, meeting in Washington, are a group of folks who hopefully will be willing to step outside the intensity of the partisan arena and reach a bipartisan agreement. I mean, if they, using Simpson-Bowles basically as their template. You had the Gang of Six in the Senate. Unfortunately, it's now the Gang of Five. But, you know, they lost one. But in any event, I genuinely believe if you look at the Senate today, that if that group or a group like that, they'd have to be a bipartisan group made up of conservatives and liberals, reached a consensus around a package built off of Simpson-Bowles, which is what they were working off of, that you'd have 30 to 40 people sign on to it immediately. And with presidential leadership, you'd pass it overwhelmingly, at least in the Senate. And then you have the Biden group, which unfortunately I just learned about 15 minutes ago is broken down, supposedly. But hopefully they can pull back together. Because we all understand one basic rule of American politics and American life. Really, this is more of a cultural rule than a political rule. And that's this. Every generation in America's history has passed on to the next generation a more prosperous and stronger nation. But if we, and I'm talking now about the baby boom generation, do not address this issue made up by this problem, we will be the first generation in the history of this nation to pass on to our children a less prosperous and therefore less safe world and less safe nation. Something we can't do, we can't allow it to happen, and we need to get some action now. And to get action, we need some leadership. Thank you very much. Be happy to take a question. I guess Professor Brooks is coming up to help the question.
I'm going to pose the first question, and then we'll take some questions from the audience, and we'll have plenty of time for that. I would like to set some ground rules for this talk and also for our future talks as well, since hopefully we'll see a lot of you there. First of all, try to keep your questions concise, no multi-paragraph questions, and also, which are common, you know, in academic settings, especially by professors. And also, just one question per person. Unfortunately, we don't have time for one person to do multiple follow-ups. Also, it really needs to be an actual question as opposed to a statement. There's a big difference.
Statements are okay if they agree with me.
Well, but questions are more interesting because then we get to hear from you. I guess my first question is, hindsight being 2020 and with the concerns that you have about the deficit and the debt, if you had it to do over again, would you still vote in favor of the Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003? And
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. First off, I don't see those tax cuts as having generated the problem. In fact, if you look at it statistically, basically by the 2006-2007 period, we were generating more revenue. We can go back to that slide. We were generating more revenue than had historically been generated. And the reason's pretty simple. It's called human nature. If you give people a better incentive to invest, then they're going to invest their money. But if you say that you're going to keep their taxes at a level where investment becomes problematic for them, they're basically going to invest either to avoid taxes, which is totally inefficient, or they're simply going to sit on the sidelines. And so a tax law that encourages investment in capital formation, as those tax cuts did, especially with the capital gains and dividends rates, is very constructive to getting an economy going and making it stronger. Secondly, the statistics as to the distribution of those tax cuts is pretty startling. I mean, it doesn't get written about because the New York Times won't write about it. But as a very practical matter, after the tax cuts were in place, the top 20% of income producers in this country were paying 85.4% of the income tax. Top 20% paid 85.4% of the income tax. That was 3% higher than the top 20% paid under the Clinton years. And why was that? Well, it was because there was more economic activity and they were willing to pay more because they felt their taxes were fair. And the bottom 40% of people with income in this country actually were getting more back from the government than they got under the Clinton years, because the bottom 40% don't actually pay taxes, but many of them benefit from the earned income tax credit or other social benefits, safety net benefits. So you actually had a law that ended up being more progressive and was generating more revenue. And I think that was a function of human nature, common sense, and it was good policy.
Okay. I'm going to ask one more question before I take some from the audience, just because I think it's important. I think we're going to come back to this topic a lot over the course of this quarter and in other classes as well. You've been on the Hill or close to it for most of 3 decades, and that is, what are the changes you've seen over time in the tenor of doing business on the Hill, on the ability to get legislation passed? What have you noticed has changed, and has it become more problematic?
Well, there have been a lot of changes. When I got to the House of Representatives, the House had been controlled by the Democratic Party for 30 years, and Republicans were irrelevant, and there was extreme partisanship. Tip O'Neill was the Speaker, and he was as tough a person as I ever came across in politics, and he was very aggressive in making sure that his policies went through irrelevant of what the Republican positions were. The minority had very little say. So I don't think, and if you read the American history, partisanship has always been aggressive. I mean, you read the period of Lincoln's presidency, I mean, it was vicious. What's changed are 2 things. The first thing that's changed is that the system, because of the 24/7 news cycle and cable television, has basically highlighted the shouters. And whether it's MSNBC or Fox News, it's the shouter on the left or the shouter on the right. And there's very little substantive dialogue about problems that's in the middle. It's all exaggerated statements, because that's the way you get advertising. You've got to get attention, so you've got to be exaggerated. And that television, or that media, that 24/7 cable cycle, which is so exaggerated in its positions on both sides, has been massively amplified by the blogosphere, where people who used to be at the margin on the political process now have a capacity to communicate with a large number of people and draw out anything they want. And the more outrageous it is, the more likely it is to get attention, and the more likely it is to fill up the airspace. And so again, that has aggravated rational discussion of issues. And I think that's a real problem for us as a culture, but I don't know how to address it. I mean, it's all freedom of speech, so it's just a fact of life. The second thing that's happening right now, which I'm very worried about, is the way the Senate is functioning. You know, the Senate was structured by Randolph and Madison when they designed this government. This government was designed around the concept of checks and balances. I was talking with one of the students earlier who came from England, and we were discussing the difference between the American government and the English government. And a parliamentary system, the party of governance governs because it has absolute control. And it can do whatever it wants. And that's why you see parliamentary systems swing to the left and then swing to the right. American governance was designed by Randolph and Madison to be a government of checks and balances and to be played between the 40-yard lines. And it always has been that way. Now, there's been aberrational periods like Lyndon Johnson's presidency and the first 2 years of the Obama presidency, where you had a majority that was so huge of the governing party that they did not need the minority to participate. And that's why you got a number of bills in the last 2 years, which I think were really, really unfortunate. But what's happening in the Senate now is that the Senate is starting to replicate the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is managed by the majority party in a very autocratic way through what's known as the Rules Committee. And they control, and the Speaker of the House controls what comes to the floor, how long the speeches can be on it, and what the amendments are. And if he doesn't or she doesn't want any amendments, she just has the Rules Committee send a rule to the floor that doesn't have any amendments. And it's a very autocratic system. The Senate was always conceived and developed as the place where the minority always had the voice and was always protected. The Senate is where the minority is protected. Whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, the minority is always protected. It took 60 votes to pass anything. And because legislation, when it came to the floor of the Senate, was always open to amendment, any amendment on any subject. You could bring a bill out on defense, and you could get an amendment on protecting the black swan in South Dakota. I mean, anything could come up on an amendment on the floor of the Senate. When I first got there and I'd manage a bill, I knew I was going to get a whole lot of amendments that had nothing to do with my bill, but you just lived with it. You just went through it, and after 2 or 3 days of debate, you passed the bill, hopefully. But that was because the Senate is the cauldron, you know, is the saucer. You know, Washington said the Senate's the saucer into which the hot coffee is poured. And it's supposed to be that way. Unfortunately now, the Senate is not taking any votes of any significance. The majority is trying to protect the majority members from having to take tough votes that the minority might offer as amendments. And they're doing what's called fill the tree, which they bring a bill to the floor and then they fill the tree and there are no amendments of any significance to the bill. And it's really, I think, undermining the whole concept of minority rights in our system. And I'm a great believer in the Senate, its structure and its purpose, which is to protect the minority. And if you do not in a democracy protect the minority, you're not going to have a democracy for very long, in my opinion.
Okay, questions from the audience? Okay, we've got a question back here. Yes, and here's a microphone.
You showed the chart of what can be done, but you didn't talk about it.
Yeah, because
Could
I'm
you
not
put-
in office any longer, but I wanted to show you that there are ways to do this. But it really comes down to doing 4 or 5 major things. First is addressing the entitlement reform. And there are a lot of different levels of entitlement reform, but you can fix the Social Security system in about 10 minutes if you had the political will to do it, because there are only 4 or 5 moving parts. To change the way we calculate the COLA, you change what's known as the bend points, which is basically means testing. And you raise the age over a long period of time. You know, in 30 years you raise it 1 year, another 30 years you raise it another year. And then it becomes solvent. Medicare is a much more complex issue, but there are lots of things we could do in the Medicare arena. The tax reform issue needs a fundamental new look. My view is that Simpson-Bowles was on the right track. I guess I believe that is because they basically used as their template a bill called the Gregg bill, which took the tax law and essentially eliminated all the deductions, a large number of deductions and exemptions, not all of them in our bill. Simpson-Bowles eliminated them all, and then reduced rates dramatically. And by reducing rates dramatically, you create a much greater incentive for economic activity and for compliance. And I believe you get a lot more revenue, a lot more revenue. So there, you know, immigration policy wasn't on the chart, but we need an immigration policy in this country that encourages smart people to come to our country and stay here and create jobs. We have just the opposite right now. We discourage that. We need an energy policy which encourages production in the United States and discourages purchasing overseas. So there's a lot of different things we can do, but I'm not in government, so I can just throw out a few that I feel like.
Other questions? Okay, we've got a question over here, in the middle here. Microphone.
Hi. Vice President Cheney, very recently, in historical terms, was supposed to have suggested that Reagan proved that deficits don't matter. Do you think he'd say that today? And what did you think at the time when you heard that he'd said that?
Well, I didn't hear him say that, but maybe I can go back to that chart there. Oops, losing my microphone here. So are we still on these charts? Okay, good. This is a good chart to discuss that issue with, not that you want a long discussion of it. But you'll see in this period, we ran a large number of deficits from 1965 right up to 2000, and then again after 2000. Why were we able to do that? Because we were a strong enough country, and we had a national debt structure where we could absorb those deficits. They were doable deficits. It would be better if we hadn't had them in many instances, but they were manageable. The problem we have going forward is that we no longer have that seed corn available to us. We've used up, we weren't at 60% of GDP back then. We were at 35% of GDP, debt to GDP ratio. Now we're at 60% headed to 100%. Much different situation now. I think Reagan probably would have liked to have surpluses. Clearly the surpluses in the late 1990s were great from my perspective. Sometimes you can have, I don't want to get into that debate, but sometimes you can have too much surplus because you, but as a practical matter, we haven't got that problem. We're not going to have it in a long time, so we don't have to worry about that one. But right now our problem is we've used up our seed corn. We're not borrowing from ourselves, we're borrowing from overseas, and we've got a debt to GDP ratio which is unsustainable, neither of which was happening when we were running those deficits earlier. We were borrowing very little from overseas, and it was all within a 35% range of debt to GDP.
Okay. Other questions from the audience? We have somebody in the aisle right here in red.
Up on your slide in the bottom left-hand corner, it says the source is SBC Republican Staff, comma, CBO.
Right.
Can you explain what that is, please?
Senate Budget Committee, Congressional Budget Office. Well, the Senate Budget Committee is Republican staff, but the CBO numbers are the ones that are scored here. We all use CBO numbers in the Budget Committee.
Okay. Other questions? I saw some hands.
CBO is
Okay.
considered to be the
So
fair
were you
umpire
pointing?
of numbers, even though they have arcane scoring systems, which everybody disagrees with, but they're the baseline.
Let's get a microphone over on this side here.
Thank you. I'm wondering whether you have attempted to persuade the Republican candidates for president about your 6 easy solutions and whether any of them have adopted any of those suggestions.
I haven't, and I'm not aware that they have.
Okay. Next question.
There's a question.
I'm
A
seeing.
couple
Okay. I'm
questions over
sorry.
there.
It's hard to see with these lights. There's a question over here on this side.
A couple questions
Hi.
there.
You mentioned the seed corn. I've heard a lot of discussion that the reason that seed corn was present in the past was that we had a good, strong manufacturing base in this country, and that since that time we've had manufacturing move considerably out of the country. Recently, I've heard that there is a lot more focus on bringing manufacturing back into this country. I was wondering if that's in fact true. Are there any serious efforts underway, and are any of them really thought to work? So.
Well, we've shifted from a manufacturing-based economy to an information-based economy. And yes, many manufacturing jobs have moved overseas because in a comparative situation, going back to Adam Smith, that's where they're able to do them more efficiently. And as a result, we end up buying those products at a lower cost, so Americans benefit from a higher standard of living by having a product paid for at a lower cost. The key for our economy is to, however, continue to be at the cutting edge of technologies, and whether it's in health or electronics or information or software, where we're basically ahead of the rest of the world and we're selling products to the rest of the world that they need, and we're able to have the next generation be our production as versus coming from China and India, which is our big competitor in the communication age, in technology of the communication age. And that really is tied to higher education and our capacity to keep and bring smart people into the United States, in my opinion. So I'm not of the view that you grow the economy by protecting jobs which probably can't compete. I'm of the view you grow the economy by creating jobs which outcompete the rest of the world. And New Hampshire is a classic example of that, honestly. We get about 30% of our state's economy is tied to export, because we export high value-added things, electronics and software primarily. And we outcompete the rest of the world with these products. And then that 30% of our economy that's export-related feeds into the rest of the economy and pays for the restaurants and the car repairs and automobile dealerships and everything else that feeds off of those original equipment events. So my view is that the way we stay ahead of the rest of the world and the way we create jobs is we create an atmosphere for entrepreneurs to take risks, make investments, and have an educational system which produces the people which will give us the cutting edge advantage. I don't think we do it through protectionism.
Okay. On the, right over here in the green.
So while the major driving force behind our deficit and our debt is healthcare costs, it seems like that's the one thing we really need to address. And the one thing a lot of people talk about is bending the healthcare curve. Now, Obama tried to do this through regulation of delivery in his Affordable Care Act, and we've seen the Republican response by Paul Ryan, basically trying to do it on an individualized voucher system with elements of premium support, while repealing all of the reforms and regulation that Obama did to delivery. Do you think that by completely turning healthcare over to basically a free market under Paul Ryan, while repealing all that regulation by Obama, would that be superior to turning it over to a voucher system and keeping the regulation, given that healthcare is one of the places where the free market kind of stumbles?
Well, I don't think there's a simple answer. I don't think you can use a broad brush to address healthcare, and you've got the leading expert in the world here as your president, and you've got the leading institute in the United States on healthcare, comparative cost of healthcare right here at Dartmouth. So you folks are the people we're going to look to, but to me it's an incredibly complex matrix, and there's no simple answer to it, but you need a variety of approaches philosophically. And the first approach is that you encourage quality and outcomes over utilization and repetition. And that drives costs down. Second is that you do get the patient and the patient's families vested in the interest of outcome and cost. And thirdly, that you don't try to manage everything out of Washington. That most of the creative activity in healthcare delivery does not occur because some bureaucrat in Washington thinks of it. It occurs because some doctor, some hospital, or some state agency, in many instances dealing with Medicaid, thinks of it. And so you don't straitjacket your creativity by requiring it to be subject to a one-size-fits-all out of Washington. But those are very broad brushes. But healthcare can't be, it's not like Social Security. Social Security has 4 or 5 moving parts, you can solve them, and you've corrected the problem. Healthcare is a constantly evolving, mutating event because of research, development, aging population. There's so many different factors. But what you have to have is a system that has some basic goals and drivers that I think push better delivery at lower costs.
Any other questions on healthcare, particularly while we're on that topic?
I won't take one from the president of the college. I would be embarrassed because he would have the answer and I would not.
Questions? Hands down here, in 4th row.
You spoke earlier about how when the impending doom that you've spoken about hits, there will be a lower quality of life in the United States, as you said.
Lower standard of living.
Yeah, sorry. My bad. But would making the budget cuts and the broad cuts to the programs that many people in Washington are currently suggesting, would that not have the same effect in terms of lowering people's standard of living?
Only if you believe government creates prosperity, something I don't happen to agree with. My view is that government is there to protect people of lesser ability and means and to give them a reasonable lifestyle and to make sure that we address the core issues of making sure the society functions correctly and that people don't act inappropriately, both in business and in personal lives. But really, prosperity doesn't come from the government. Prosperity comes from individuals who are willing to go out and take risks and create jobs. And if you create an atmosphere where a person is willing to go out and take that risk and create a job, then you're going to do a lot more for that community where that job's created than to have the government come in and try to tell you what the right job is and then try to train you or create the job in the public sector. That's just a very deep philosophical view of mine.
Okay. Next question, we have Lawrence up here in the front, in 3rd row. Here.
Hi. You've already mentioned in your speech today the need for America, if it's to continue competing with other nations, to specialize in kind of technologies and kind of to make sure that its workers are more educated to an extent and more specialized. Given that, how do you feel about the current state of American education and the fact that, in areas such as sciences, America is, coming further down the list of countries in the world, and how do you think, what do you think can be done to improve that situation?
Well, our public education system is a disaster. Our university system is still the best in the world. But we really have and we've had for a fair amount of time now, a very serious problem with our inability to educate young people and bring them through the school system in a way that makes them productive citizens, or makes the vast majority of them productive citizens, and makes us a competitive nation with the rest of the world. I, along with Ted Kennedy and John Boehner at the time, he was just, and and Miller, what was Miller's first name? George Miller from California wrote No Child Left Behind, the purpose of which was to try to get transparency into the public educational system so that parents could make better choices based off of clear, transparent, ascertainable standards of subjects that could be looked at objectively in the 3rd and 8th grade. It's unfortunately been watered down because people didn't like being held to ascertainable standards and being compared to each other. School systems didn't like that. I was governor in 1990 when President George H. Bush called the first conference of governors that had been called since Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, to Charlottesville, Virginia. And the whole purpose of the conference was, what do we do about elementary and secondary school education? And it came to the same conclusions you'd come to if we'd held the conference today. So it's been a reasonably intractable problem. There are a lot of ways to address it, but when you get right down to it, education is a cultural thing. If people don't value it, they don't require people to pursue it. And you have, unfortunately, a lot of parenting in this country which doesn't value education. And furthermore, in my opinion, if you don't create a competition, you don't create quality. I mean, why do you buy one car over another car? It's because of competition. And so when you have a system that's stratified and has no competition within it, then basically there's no reason to improve. And so I happen to be a supporter of charter schools and a public school voucher and a private school voucher for that matter, and of merit pay. And, but it's really not the teachers who are the issue, in my opinion. It's the whole culture that is undervalued education, especially at the secondary and elementary school level. And it's a real problem for us as a nation, and we're going to start to feel the effects of it. China graduates 300,000 engineers a year. We graduate 30,000. You know, maybe ours are better and brighter, but they're going to catch up with us pretty quickly if they keep going at that rate.
Okay, next question. We've got somebody up here in orange.
Going along those lines, another issue that you've mentioned, especially in the 6 proposals you made, was retaining high-skilled immigrants.
Right.
And I was kind of curious as to what your thoughts were on bipartisan legislation and attaching that to some aspects of the DREAM Act, and whether that would be a realistic possibility in terms of the near term and maybe even the longer term.
Well, we should do it. We should do major immigration reform. It's hung up on the issue of amnesty, which is foolish. Not that I think there should be amnesty, I don't, but I believe there's a way around that issue. Immigration reform should have 4 or 5 moving parts. Number one, you should secure the border. There's no excuse at all for a nation our size and ability not to be able to control our own borders and determine who comes in. And we should secure the border. And the American people won't accept any sort of substantive immigration reform until they believe the border is secure. So politically you have to do it, but substantively you should do it. Second, employers should be subject to very strict and enforceable and enforced regulations on their hiring, so they're not hiring people who come over the border illegally. Thirdly, there should be a guest worker program that works, so that if you're from another country, most likely Central America or Mexico, and you want to come to the United States and work, you can do it under a guest worker program. It should be a very robust guest worker program. Fourth, for all the folks who are here illegally, and unfortunately there are a lot, and we don't know how many, but once you secure the border, hopefully there'd be many fewer coming in, if any, hopefully very, very few. Obviously not going to stop everything. You should have a pathway to legal status, which requires doing things which are a reflection of the fact that you're here illegally, but not a pathway to citizenship. You shouldn't be able to come here illegally and become a citizen, but you should be able to get some sort of legal status, called a blue card, so that you're not being abused by people who know you're here illegally. And fifth, and I think this is probably the most important, but it won't occur until you do some of the first ones, you need to have a system that rewards people who come, that says we want certain people here who can bring more to our culture in the way of activity that we need. You know, a physicist, a doctor. And if you try to go into Canada, move to Canada and get a green card, you will be scored on what you bring, you know, what your degrees are and whether a company wants you to come because you can add something of value. Bill Gates testified before the committee I chaired, the Health Committee, a number of times, and he would make the very simple point that every time he brought in somebody from India or China who was a scientist who helped him out in his creation of product at Microsoft, he added 4, 5, 15 jobs around that person. That person became a job creating center. And he couldn't understand why we wouldn't bring that person to the United States rather than leave them in India or China where they would be the job creation center. And it makes no sense. So we should have a green card system which rewards bringing people into the country because they bring certain skills which we need as a nation. We should be willing to say to the best and the brightest across this globe, if you want to come to the United States, we're willing to consider having you here. Instead, we say just the opposite. If you get a graduate degree here at Dartmouth in some sort of science or something, you're going to have trouble staying in this country. You're going to find it very challenging.
Okay, more questions. We've got one up here in the rainbow shirt.
Continuing along those lines, in Georgia with the recent immigration law that they've passed that goes into effect on July 1st, one of the stipulations of that law is that employers are subject to these sort of strict regulations that you're talking about just now. And one of the consequences of that has been that because a lot of the illegal immigrants in Georgia have left either to go to other states or to go back to their home countries, some of the peach and other crops that sustain a lot of South Georgia's economy are, they're leaving 5, 6 of those unpicked because they simply can't find workers because they've all left before this law goes into effect. So how do you, if you do institute these strict regulations on employers to which
that's why you can't do it just that. You have to have a guest worker program. And we have something called an H-2A program, which basically allows guest workers to come in just for agricultural purposes. So you need to, you can't have one of these. They're all linked together. And furthermore, you shouldn't have the states doing it. I mean, states have to do it now because the federal government is not doing what it should be doing, which is setting up a major immigration reform bill. So places like Arizona are just so frustrated. They've acted unilaterally as states, but this really should be done at the national level through major comprehensive immigration reform. It has to be comprehensive is the key term. I mean, if you just did an employer sanction bill, that would create all sorts of adverse selection problems for us, like you've outlined.
Okay, next question. Anything on international affairs? We had a major speech by President Obama yesterday. Any questions on that?
There are a bunch of questions back there.
Okay, I'm sorry, right, Chart?
There's some folks back there.
Okay, we'll come back to you next. We've got a question over here.
You've spoken about reforming entitlements. In regards to decreasing spending, do you believe we should look at or reduce our defense spending commitment in order to bring balance to the budget?
Absolutely. Simpson-Bowles had a very significant reduction in the rate of growth. And actually, it was a real reduction in defense spending. Most of it will come in the area of procurement, strategic weapon procurement, and non-active duty personnel costs. So yes, we absolutely have to do that.
Okay, did we have
There are a couple in the back there.
a question?
There's
Okay.
4 or 5
back here.
Hi. I believe you mentioned that part of the reason Japan has been able to finance their debt is their high savings rate.
Right.
And also it seems that a deficit isn't always a problem if you use the borrowed money in order to finance new projects or invest in future development. So is there any legislation or policy that could be used to increase the U.S. savings rate, or is that totally impractical because we'd have to cut consumption?
Well, an interesting phenomenon that's occurred as a result of this recent recession, which is the most severe recession we've seen since the Great Depression, is that the savings rates have gone up significantly. And one of the reasons I think many people would say that we haven't seen the type of recovery you usually get coming out of recession is because our natural consumer nature as a society is not returned at its robust levels, and people are saving. And why is this? It's a very simple, in my opinion, I'm not an economist, but I'm looking at it just as a pragmatist. What happened here was in 2008, we were on the verge of fiscal calamity like something we'd never seen since the Great Depression. And there was a huge reduction in the net worth of a large number of Americans. And most of them were right on the verge of retirement. This was the baby boom generation. So you had all these baby boomers who'd gone into defined contribution plans, suddenly find that what they expected to have when they retired in 3, 4, 5, 6 years was no longer there. And so there's been this great retrenchment by that generation, which once again is the largest generation in the country and has had the most impact on this nation ever since it was born. A great retrenchment in consumer activity by that generation. It would have occurred anyway because they were moving into retirement. They didn't have to be as consumer-oriented, but it's been, I think, multiplied dramatically. Now, there's been no studies on this, but I think it's common sense tells you that. So that's one of the reasons I think this recovery has been so anemic, is that basically people are saving more, and especially the baby boom generation is saving a lot more than it historically did, and it was the driver of consumer activity in this country. That was a good question. Thank you. All these questions have been great. Thank you.
It's been great. Okay, we've got a question in the middle.
I'm not even in politics anymore, I can say that.
Senator, why don't you run for president? That's another election you could win.
That's very nice of you to say. But if my wife were here, you'd know the answer, and it'd be very brief.
Okay.
30 years of elected politics has been fun. I've greatly enjoyed, and Kathy and I have greatly enjoyed the chance to represent New Hampshire, and we've had a great time doing it, but at some point you say that enough's enough. Got to move on and do something else because it's time.
Okay, we've got a question up here by Professor Whelan.
Thank you for the comment.
So I have the obligation of drawing it to a close, but I wanted to finish with a multi-part question because I've got the mic and this is the end.
I'm not sure I can do multi-part. Putting a lot of pressure.
It's really kind of one question that I can dress up if I play with the clauses. We have part of the benefit of this whole series is we have lots of people coming through and we'll get different opinions, and it's almost a continuing dialogue all summer. So to that end, we have Secretary of Treasury Geithner coming tomorrow. Could you talk briefly about your experience with the TARP negotiations and then tell us the question that you would ask the Treasury Secretary with regard to the ongoing systemic risk?
Well, he wouldn't answer it.
That's okay. Just tell us why you would ask it.
The TARP negotiations, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, back in 2008, well, you're familiar with the event, but maybe not the specifics. In 2008, we as a nation and the world were on the brink of catastrophe like that had never been seen before, and that the entire financial system was about to come to a stop, a screeching stop. And I was asked by the Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, to lead the Republican effort to try to address this, as Secretary Paulson at the time had sent up a request for $700 billion in order to basically be able to stand behind America's financial system. That had come out of a Thursday night meeting, I think it was Thursday night, when a group of us, myself, Senator Dodd, Congressman Franks, I'm trying to think, there were 2 or 3 other members in the room, had been called in late at night, about 9:30, by our leaders as the designated folks who were supposed to manage this issue relative to our caucuses. And we met with Secretary Paulson, who's going to be here, and you should ask him to recount this period because it's fascinating, and Chairman Bernanke. And they came up to the Capitol in room 19, I think it was, just off the Senate floor. And they walked in, they sat down, and there were probably 8 of us around this table who had been delegated the responsibility by our leadership to address this issue. And they said that if we didn't act within 72 hours, the entire banking system of the United States would shut down, and the world would follow it. It was one of the most startling meetings I'd ever been in, obviously. And they weren't kidding. This was not hyperbole. In fact, just the night before, one of the most profitable corporations in this country had been unable to move funds from one bank to another bank, and it was using hundreds of banks, and not been unable to move any funds in order to open its franchises the next day, because the banks didn't trust each other. After the Lehman collapse, no bank trusted any other bank anywhere in the world. And under the way our system works, there has to be confidence between counterparties. So what what Secretary Paulson asked for was a number that was so high that the world would realize that the United States government was going to stand behind the banking system, and that would settle things down. It was not unlike, if you read the history of the Great Depression, it was not unlike what J.P. Morgan, not the history of the Great Depression, the run on banks back in, I think it was 1897 or something, and J.P. Morgan did this. But he did it individually. But basically, he just wanted a number that was so huge that nobody in the world would think we weren't going to be behind our banking system, and therefore the banks could start to lend with each other. And the TARP negotiations went on for 48 straight hours, all day long, the next 2 days, Friday and Saturday. And Chairman Paulson told us that if we didn't have a conclusion by 5 o'clock on Sunday that was firm, that we were going to have the crisis because the Asian markets opened at 6 o'clock. So at around about 12:30 at night, on Saturday night, the negotiations completely broke down over an issue called recoupment. And then literally off in a corner office, the way politics works in its most interesting form, Secretary Paulson, Rahm Emanuel, myself, the Speaker of the House, and Barney Frank said, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do it this way, and it was done. And it was an amazing experience. Government worked. Government worked. And it's been demonized ever since, but it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Stabilize the financial system of this country and therefore the world, and in the process made the taxpayers about $20 billion in profit. So it was a pretty good project. Well, what I asked Secretary Geithner, it would be a very blunt question. It would be, why did you walk away from Simpson Bowles? Why didn't the president, the table was set, it was done by his own commission, $4 trillion of savings, it was there, it was ready to be taken and run with, all it needed was presidential leadership. Why did you folks stand down on that and walk away from it, rather than take it up and make it the cause for the solution of our problems?
We will ask that on your behalf, and then we'll let him ask Ambassador Huntsman a question. We'll do it all summer.
You can credit it to me.
And then the last guy will call you.
Geithner's never going to return any of my calls now. Secretary Geithner, who I admire. I think he's a great guy.
I want to thank you. All of you have only seen the tip of the iceberg with respect to Senator Gregg's generosity. We started with lunch with students. We had a class, and throughout that all, he's managed to be not only interesting, but to give us different perspectives on all of his various involvements. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you. We hope to see you back tomorrow at 4 o'clock in Spalding for Geithner. We will ask him the question.